Hey everyone. So I decided to take my podcast and add a video component. So now it's going to be more of sort of just a vlog, if you will, or a video blog. But we're still going to try to still talk about current affairs and things like that. In addition to this video change for this episode, I'm also going to do another change. So usually we talk about three topics. This time we're going to sort of boil it down to one big issue and talk about multiple areas of that. And as you could imagine, living in DC in the time period, that issue is going to be the government shutdown. So we're going to do a big episode talking about the government shutdown. And in addition to that, we're going to talk about some of the reforms in regards to the budgeting process and also with Congress itself to make it perhaps more efficient, allowed some more fluidity rather than the gridlock we seem to be facing and we see year after year, at least for the last few decades. So with that being said, I'm going to start with the general background of the shutdown and my thoughts, and then we're going to go on from there. So with the shutdown, it's pretty much a joke, and I'm glad that most people would agree that it's a pretty one-sided fault on this position. Even the media, which usually tries to be neutral and not objective, and that's something I'm going to get to in later this blog. Even the media in this case is calling out a small faction of the Republican Party, largely the Tea Party, who will not negotiate the part of Obamacare um, and instead are going to hold the entire government hostage and not allow for the government to essentially function or pay its bills or for workers to do what their jobs are to do until it happens. But Jon Stewart made a really good point a few days ago, and that's that it's interesting that Republicans always talk about small government, like we need to get the government out of everything. And effectively, you would think the shutdown would be their dream. But then they criticize the Democrats for saying, look, the national parks are closed, the memorials are closed, look, the World War II veterans who couldn't go to their own memorial, and like all these services that the government can't do anymore, all thanks to the Democrats. At least that's the Republican argument. For which I'm like, what the heck? Like, you guys are the ones saying government is bad, and now you're saying these services are essentially good and that it's bad that these services are blocked? Well, if you really believe that they're bad, then you wouldn't care that they're blocked. Or if you did believe that these services are good, you wouldn't use the other rhetoric. Either way, you're a hypocrite. And it's sad that I understand that there is a debate that needs to be had over the Affordable Care Act. I completely agree with that. But the time and place isn't to do that when it comes to paying the government bills, especially since now there's a government shutdown over it. And if you look over time, this is the first time where there's been a government shutdown because of a specific ideology against a certain bill. Yes, there have been shutdowns in the past, but mostly those for budget negotiations, such as the ones that happened under the Clinton administration. But this one is solely because they do not want to really implement the Affordable Care Act. They want to delay it, which I think is a horrible idea because it's already been delayed. And let's see the effects. Let's let it go into effect. Like I mentioned in my last few videos and online, let's see what the Affordable Care Act does. So far, it's been shown to actually lower costs. I'll let it run a few years, and then we'll work from there. With that being said, this government shutdown is having tremendous impacts. And let me just put my own sort of 2 cents in there, since I actually live in DC, and I feel like if I say that DC is the most affected city, that is an objective statement. Just statistically, morally, whatever way you look at it, the city I live in is the city most impacted by the shutdown, and that is Washington, D.C. Right now, millions of workers are impacted indirectly, and thousands are affected directly. They either have to go to work for no pay or they're at home. And there was a recent article by the Washington Post that found that a lot of federal workers are now filing for unemployment insurance and unemployment benefits, and it's just ridiculous. These are people who are doing a lot for the economy, and when you hurt them, there's a big multiplier negative effect, which means not only are those people not working, but the people who need their services are also going to be affected. So, for example, if you work for Meals on Wheels or something like that, or say the Department of Energy, and say you were furloughed, well, not only is that employee no longer employed and therefore losing revenue, but the services that he or she did are now also not going to be there, also hurting the economy. So that's like fewer meals delivered, say you work for Meals on Wheels or DOE, fewer reports filed, so that hurts there. And then there's a multiplier because with less revenue, these employees, are spending less at the store, less at the bank, or saving or spending, and at the end of the day, it's a very bad negative multiplier, and that has disastrous consequences for the economy. Bloomberg wrote a piece. Bloomberg, not the mayor, but the website, the news organization, so to speak. They did a calculation that for every day of the shutdown, approximately $300 million is cut essentially from the U.S. economy, and that number is largely considered conservative. Some say the number is a lot higher, and the more and more we continue the shutdown, the more things are affected. One thing that's personally affecting me, and also something that affects a lot of people who come to DC either for work or live here, is the DC Metro, because although it is currently operational, it is estimated that if the shutdown goes long enough, the DC part of the Metro, because Maryland and Virginia side are controlled by their respective state entities, but the DC portion of the Metro could shut down. And you might have not known this. I actually found this out today, that DC is the second most used subway system in the United States after New York. That's incredible. I did not know that till today, and I use the Metro all the time. The DC Metro, again, let me repeat that, is the second most used public transportation metro system in the United States, with the exception of New York, which makes sense. And that's crazy, because DC is not even the second or third largest city, but yet we have the highest traffic concentration. And we also have the most accidents per capita, I believe. But that's a statistic to talk about for another day. Anyway, this government shutdown is affecting real people's lives, and if government is designed to help people, this is definitely not the way to go. I understand that there are problems with the Affordable Care Act, but this is not the time and place to do that. And I do have to give a shout out to the moderate faction of the Republican Party, because they have talked about passing a clean spending bill, especially people like Tom Coburn, who is by no means a liberal or even a moderate in terms of ideology. He's very much a conservative politician, and that's not surprising given that he's a Republican, and also the ways he's voted in the past. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But the fact that even he is saying, the debate, this is not the time and place for the debate about the Affordable Care Act. Let's pass a clean budget bill, and Ted Cruz is doing things that are just not politically not feasible. These are words coming out of Ted, excuse me, I forget if he's a senator or representative, but Congressman Coburn's mouth. The words I just said were coming out of him, so you can look that up, and it's amazing, because the moderate Republicans are actually being pretty reasonable, at least in the sense that they want to actually get government functioning again. But you know that Speaker Boehner is not going to bring it up to the floor, and so we see serious problems with that, because it's estimated that there could possibly be enough votes within the House to actually pass a clean spending bill. But the problem is, within the House, the Speaker controls the agenda and what's set. So as long as Boehner doesn't want it to come to the floor, he basically has control over that as well. And it's sad. I mean, theoretically, the majority could override the rule processes. A majority of the Congress could override the rule process and pass it, but it's getting into very dicey political, jurisdictional territory, and I don't think anyone's going to even risk that, even though this is probably the one time you should risk that, given that the government is shut down for quite a few days now. It's been a couple, more than a couple days, and it's likely to continue. And the big fear is that the shutdown might even coincide with the debt limit situation, in which right now there's a certain cap on it's sort of like a max out limit, so to speak. Like on a credit card, there's a certain amount you can max out to. It's sort of like that with the public debt. But unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't have the ability to just pay it off or anything. I mean, we have to raise it. And just to clarify, a lot of people think that it adds new debt. No, it's just paying for the debt that's already there. I understand the debate about getting rid of bad debt and reducing it, but with bills you already incur, it's just logical sense to raise the debt ceiling. And if you go back to my first podcast, I talk about why the debt is not as big of a deal as politicians and many people believe. Although debt is important, it mainly matters on what your debt to GDP ratio is, how much is foreign and how much is public, whether you can print your own currency, and how high is the public debt compared to private debt. So how high is the government debt compared to that of people, the aggregate of people's credit card and other sort of like house debts and things like that. But again, that's an issue for another day. If you want to hear more on the importance or lack of importance of the debt and how we really should understand the debt, go back to podcast number 1, where I talk about the debt crisis, which I believe is the third topic I talk about in podcast number 1. So if you want more information on that, go check that out. But going back to this, going back to this whole shutdown fiasco, I mean, most people agree it's just a ridiculous deal. And there's been crazy things happening in the city. If you haven't already heard, a woman was fatally shot in a car chase that occurred a couple of days ago, I believe. The situation was, I believe, that she hit the gate or something at the White House and then fled the scene, and eventually she was shot, and she was killed. And there was apparently she had a daughter or someone like that in the car. The daughter, or whoever it was, the child was okay, and now there's a debate over whether or not the DC police should have used lethal force. I personally don't know enough details. I feel like it's such a recent event that I can't judge, on my opinion. But I do have to say that the city is on edge. I mean, even before the shutdown, we just recently had the Navy Yard shooting, which was a very sad and tragic event. And again, I talk about these mass shootings in my first podcast and go into depth on what it means and passing policies to prevent these tragedies in the future. But going back to this crisis, the city is like a lot is going on. Like this guy set himself on fire. I think that was yesterday on Friday, I believe. But it was put out, so he didn't die. But still, I think he sustained third-degree burns, and it was just crazy. Like I have some friends from California, because that's where I'm originally from, asking me like, is the city in anarchy? And truthfully, it's not. But if there is something like anarchy, I bet DC and probably in the United States, with the exception of maybe Detroit, is probably closer there than most other cities. But I do have to say this. Apparently, a music critic, I forget his name, said like this quote that I think kind of accurately describes the situation, and that quote was, Dystopia looks a lot better in the movies." And that's very true. Like, there's in the recent movies, there's been a lot of dystopian situations, and they look kind of cool. But when it happens in real life, it's not a good deal, because people's qualities of lives are negatively affected. Um, so anyway, talking about this crisis, I mean, it's kind of depressing, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. So I want to talk about what I think should happen and certain reforms that I think could go into making Congress better. So we'll start with some simple reforms. At least on the debt ceiling side, there's this pretty good argument I heard from the Young Turks, which is a progressive news network. But the solution is pretty objective and makes sense. Is that the debt ceiling should be raised automatically, given that we have to deal with this crisis periodically from time to time, and it seems every time we have to deal with it, it just leads to a giant fiasco, because it only happens for temporary basis. Actually, that's my next point, but let me just finish up this thought. And so that the debt ceiling should be raised automatically so that we don't have this fiasco. And so talking about the thought I was just having, and that's that, it seems like we can't even pass like a real budget. If you've actually seen for the last few years, there hasn't really been a formal real budget passed. They've all been like continuing resolutions or very short-term things that literally kick the can down the road. But no one's actually going out and addressing the real problems. Or what I mean to say is that we're not passing real budgets. We're not passing long-term solutions, and that's what we really need to do. I mean, what's the point of having all these fights and all these shutdowns and all these things if at that point you don't create a full long-term process? It just seems like the most we get out of these crises are other short-term solutions, and it leads to this cycle of madness where you kick it down for 5 months, then at that 5-month part you have this big fight, and rather than doing anything substantial or long term, you just kick it for another 5 months, and then that cycle just goes on and on and on, and it usually leads to a lower quality of life, because usually in the negotiations, spending gets cut a lot from good areas too. And I know there's a good debate to be had on spending increases or decreases, but this kicking the can down the road, and I'm going to trademark the term cycle of madness, which I'm sure is already taken, but I think that phrase accurately describes the situation going on in Washington in regards to the budgeting process. So talking about some other solutions, I definitely believe congressional term limits are going to be a big big thing that need to be pushed for, and I think a lot more people realize that Congress, well, they're not the best people making decisions. Decisions. Term limits, I think, would be a good idea. It's good to have fresh blood. Um, I saw this meme that I felt was hilarious and kind of represents the generational attitudes towards Congress. It was funny. It was so just to give you a quick, if you don't know like what each generation is, the generation born sort of during and shortly after World War II is known as the baby boomers. The generation born kind of like in the 70s to, I would say, the mid 80s, around there. So I'd say like late 60s to the mid 80s is called Generation X. And those are like those would be like my parents. Think like Kurt Cobain or anyone in their like 40s is Generation X. So like most people who are in college, their parents are Generation X. Then there's Generation Y, which is my generation. So those are also known as the millennials. They were born between the 80s and I would say there's discrepancy on when it ends, but essentially 80s to the year 2000. And then from those born after the year 2000 is Generation Z. We're going to ignore Generation Z for a little bit because they're not relevant. And we're also going to ignore the silent generation, which is the generation before the baby boomers, because they're also very much non-existent, at least in the political sphere. Technically, my congressman is born in the silent generation. I'm not going to tell you who it is for anonymity, but I will talk about him later and we'll give his name. But he was actually born in the silent generation, which was before the baby boomers, so he's really old. And we're not going to talk about Generation Z, those born after the year 2000, because they don't really matter at this point. Like the oldest they could be is 13, so it's irrelevant. So let's talk about that meme. So it's funny, like they talk about Generation Y, my generation, then they say we're selfish. It's all the me generation, which, okay, that could be true. But then again, Congress is made up of the baby boomers, and they're the ones in Congress right now messing things up. So how is it my generation's fault when we're not even in Congress? I don't even understand that. The last time I looked at the demographics of Congress, there's probably less than 5 members of Generation Y. I don't even know if there is a member of formally Generation Y. These generations aren't like set dates. There's no like formal definition of when each starts and stops. So someone born, say in the late 60s or early 70s could somewhat be considered a baby boomer or might be considered Generation X. And someone born, say, in the early 80s might be considered Generation X, or they could be considered Generation Y. So there's some discrepancy. But regardless, there's very few members of my generation, even with those discrepancies, in Congress. Most of Congress, a majority of Congress, are baby boomers. And over 90% of Congress is baby boomers or Generation X. So they're the ones making the problems, not my generation. And my generation is far from perfect, but you can't blame us for like any sort of legislative problems because your generation's in Congress. I mean, I'm not trying to like be a hater right there, but that's just the truth in terms of the generations and the demographics of Congress. With that being said, that goes back to term limits, and I think it's good to have new ideas and new cycles of democracy. Like each generation brings their own sort of values, and over time, society theoretically gets better and better with each generation. So that means our generation actually has to be in power. The problem is like everyone in Congress has been there for a long, long time, and we need to like sort of recycle the system again. And that's why I think term limits would be great. Preferably, I'd like to see 2 terms, 2 term limits, or like a 2-term max, to make it more clear. For the Senate, so that means a max of 12 years in the Senate, because each Senate term is 6 years, and probably a 4 to 5 term max on House of Representatives. Each term is 2 years, so 2 times 4 times 5 is 8 or 10 respectively. And there would probably be like an overall cap where you can't spend more than 20 years overall in Congress, so it doesn't matter if you jump from representative to senator or senator to representative. Regardless of the individual Senate and House caps, you can serve no more than 20 years. I think that would be a fair cap. I mean, 20 years is a substantial amount of time. No one's going to say you can't do a lot in 20 years. That's virtually 20. That's like 1/4 of your lifespan. So if you can't do anything with 1/4 of your lifespan in Congress, then you probably shouldn't be in Congress anyway. With that being said, Term limits are going to be something very hard to pass for the proverbial reason that Congress is the one setting its own term limits, so that's going to be something that's going to be really, really hard to do. But I think there is a good argument to be made there, and I think even congressmen themselves, especially the younger generations in Congress, realize that term limits could actually be a way to go. Some other reforms of Congress. I'm going to go least controversial to more controversial. Term limits are actually relatively non-controversial. There seems to be unilateral support even among Democrats and Republicans in the general populace. Some other solutions I think would help are that, like budgeting, when it comes to budgeting, and we've seen bills like this being passed actually recently, or not passed but being discussed, are tying pay to passing a budget. So if there is a government shutdown, congressmen don't get paid. So talking about that a little bit, with the shutdown, what we saw was that congressmen get paid despite the shutdown because their pay is guaranteed constitutionally. But if you pass a bill and sort of change that, I think that'd be a good idea. I mean, a lot of congressmen are withholding their pay or giving it to charity, which is good, but many aren't. And I think it just gives them a little bit more added incentive to actually work on it if it actually affects them. Um, some other reforms. Uh, well, now I guess like I wanted to think of least controversial reforms, but let's go to the more controversial ones. So I personally, and it's going to be really controversial. I personally am in favor of a one-house chamber, or a unicameral chamber for Congress, similar to the UK. Now, technically, the UK is bicameral in that they have a House of Commons and a House of Lords, but the House of Lords pretty much doesn't actually do anything really legislatively. It's sort of like the Queen. It's mostly like a figurehead, but usually everything goes through the House of Commons. So in the United States, it'd be the equivalent of just having a House of Representatives and not a Senate. Now, given that the House of Representatives is where most of the problems are with this budget process, I don't know if in this specific case it would necessarily be the best, but it would definitely help the laws pass a lot more smoothly. It would be a lot more effective, um, among other things, and I think it just helps with the overall flow of things. Now, granted, this is probably the one case where I wouldn't want a unicameral legislator because the Republicans would then go through with this budget thing, and then Obama would veto it, and then it would kind of just lead to another fiasco. But along with that, I think that I'm not really a fan of single-member districts because, and I've been talking about this a lot in my political classes, but single-member districts is how House of Representatives are elected. They're member district-based, but it's not necessarily proportional to how the public actually thinks. There's a pretty striking statistic that there's actually more people that voted for Democrats than Republicans in the House elections in 2012, but because of the way districts are set, the Republicans have control of the House. So I think that's a little bit unfair, and I think most people would agree with that. Changing to proportional representation or multi-member districts might be a good idea, but given that it's so rare and that Congress doesn't want to probably do that, and most people don't really understand what that is, I highly doubt that will ever happen in the history of the United States, at least not in the next 50 to 100 years. However, that is an idea that's used by many other Western advanced democracies, so it's not completely foreign. That's where I actually got it from, and that's what we talk about in my classes. But we have a pretty polarized system, and it would also help third-party candidates run because I have to real quickly charge this. But it would help third-party candidates run because single-member districts sort of weed out third-party candidates because it's a one-man, one-vote system. But with plurality voting or ranked choice, where you rank the candidates, I think it would be a little bit more accurate representation of how the people really feel. Okay, so with that being said, those are most of the reforms. I want to talk about another aspect of this crisis, which really regards politics in general, and that's media coverage. Now, in my blog, which I have separately from my podcasts are all on my blog, but my blog includes other things besides those podcasts. The first blog post I ever did was about neutrality versus objectivity in the media. Let me explain that difference real clear and how I feel the media is doing a bad job in the United States. The coverage of the budget crisis is actually a good exception to that, and they're heeding my advice, but usually they do a really bad job. So neutrality versus objectivity. Neutrality is not taking a side despite facts. It's trying to be neutral, but sometimes in a bad way. It's almost in a sense being biased by not being biased, and I'll explain what that means in a sec. Objectivity, on the other hand, is looking at the actual facts and making a logical conclusion based on those facts. Looking at the actual facts themselves and not being overtly biased. So I give this analogy, and I think Jon Stewart actually used this analogy. Now I used this analogy first, so just letting you know, I did not copy this from Jon Stewart, and I actually published this before he did. But the analogy I used was a baseball game. Say that the Dodgers beat the Giants in a game 5-3. An objective reporter would say the Dodgers beat the Giants 5-3. Pretty simple, right? Looking at the facts, the Dodgers won 5 points. The Giants won 3. So the Dodgers win. A neutral reporter would say the score was even. You see what I'm saying? A neutral reporter doesn't actually look at the facts. They just try to be equal to both sides, but that's not good because it's its own sort of bias. I mean, if the score actually is 5-3 and saying both sides won, it doesn't make any sense. And this is how it plays out in the media. Usually there is a certain party involved, not necessarily always the Republicans or always the Democrats. When I say party, I mean in the more generic sense. There's some sort of faction, usually responsible, are at play, or sometimes multiple players that are at fault. But you don't just say everyone's equal. This false equivalency that Bill Maher does a good job of talking about. What we do is we say, oh, everyone's equal, a pox on both their houses. But usually there is one side at fault, and the media purposely creates this false sense of equivalency that makes us think both parties are equally bad, or that everyone is doing bad at the same degree. But that is not true. The world is more complex than that. Sometimes one party might be responsible. Sometimes it may be true that both parties are responsible. Maybe the Democrats and Republicans are both at fault. Sometimes it might be a specific Republican or a specific Democrat, or maybe the president. But you have to call out people when they do bad things. That's what objectivity is all about. Looking at the facts, but then calling out people when they're guilty. We didn't just go we didn't see the oil spill and be like, it might have been BP. It might have been Exxon. It might have been Shell. No, once we found out that the evidence was it was a BP oil rig, we said BP caused this. It was a BP oil spill. That's a really easy example to understand what being objective is. But unfortunately, when it comes to politics, largely because of the rating system and the contributors of news, the news won't call out as much as they will in cases such as the BP oil spill. It's very easy to say BP did a bad job because of that oil spill. Well, yeah, everyone agrees with that. But it takes a lot of courage to look at the facts and be like, no, it wasn't both parties in this case. It was just that specific individual or that specific group. Now, I do have to say, with the shutdown, I've actually been very surprised by the media. I've seen them going after the specific faction of Republicans who refuse to negotiate, even though there are millions of lives at stake in the entire U.S. economy. And I praise that. But it's really easy because most people are on their side. Most polling data suggests that most of the American people do blame Republicans. So it doesn't really take courage when everyone already agrees the Republicans are at fault. What I look forward to seeing is the day when the media does something that's not easy for them, and that's being objective and calling out someone when they do BS, and destroying this notion of false equivalency and calling out the responsible parties. I want them to do that when it's very unpopular. That's what I look forward to. Now, that's a real courage. Unfortunately, you rarely see that. A good example of it in the fictional realm is the show Newsroom. But even in real life, there are occasions. Like the Young Turks does a good job of that, but unfortunately they're relatively underground and not that many people listen to them. In terms of the mainstream media, in terms of news most people get their news from, you have a very hard time where you don't find that often where they actually call out people when they do a bad job. They usually just say a pox on both their houses. Everyone's equally responsible, when that's not really the case. With that being said, I think that covers. It's been a pretty solid broadcast. This vlog, if you will. Talk about the shutdown, the implications, and how it just needs to get fixed, and there are some reforms on the table. But I just look forward to the day when we don't have to keep on kicking it down the road and we can do something. But I also look forward to the day when one extremist faction understands that sometimes we just need to pay our bills. It's as simple as that, and we shouldn't attach any sort of partisan ideology behind that. With that being said, I want to sort of talk about the blog itself for just a couple minutes, and then I think we'll call it a day. Um, so I really, guys, want you to show this to anyone who might be really interested in current events. Feel free to disagree with me. I actually look forward to that. Or you could agree with me, or if you have something else to say, please comment. Message me on Facebook. I usually post these blogs on my Facebook, both independently and then through my blog. Um, Please, like, let me know. I'll try to have a call-in session where, again, I want to take your calls, and I want to have like some discussions. I hope that I consider myself a political moderate, and I want to like sort of show that the American people do have a voice, and we want to be heard. So please, like, I want you to help have your voice heard. I want you to help me. I want you to help yourself, so that we can show that we are the American people. We deserve a good government. I want you to comment on the topics you want to see, because chances are, if you say I want to see you cover this, I will cover it in the next episode. So please watch. I really appreciate all your support. I really do. Please message me or whatever you want to see. And and I really do appreciate that. A few weeks ago, my podcast, my debate coach commented, and that was very gratifying, and I found that nice. And he wanted me to talk about Medicare, which I did in the next episode. And then on my second podcast, my friend Spencer, who I had never talked to in over like a year, messaged me and said, "Nice podcast," and that was really cool. So please, I wanna hear your feedback. I want you to get on this, and you can even hijack the idea and create your own blog on political affairs. And you can also, if you wanna do some sort of Skype thing that we could record, or if you want to call in so we can have a discussion and your voice could be broadcasted. I look forward to that. So please do watch. I really do appreciate it, and I do hope you all have a good day. So please all have a good day. Please watch. Tell your friends if you can, and just do the best you can in life. So enjoy your weekend while my city is falling apart in chaos. I guess, as the quote goes, dystopia looks a lot better in the movies. So until then, I'll see you next time. I appreciate all your support. See you guys later.